They say order brings peace, that a clean space reflects a clear mind. But sometimes the quiet symmetry hides a storm no one sees. What if the need for control is not strength, but a silent negotiation with chaos? Why does the smallest disruption feel like a threat to your very center? Beneath the neatly arranged surfaces lives something deeper, an anxiety that whispers, if everything stays perfect, maybe nothing will fall apart. This is not about tidiness. It's about what order is trying to protect. There is a hidden cost to constant control, a quiet exhaustion that rarely gets named. Today, we look beneath the surface. Let's begin. First, it doesn't feel like a problem. It feels like relief. There is something undeniably soothing about things being in their place. The symmetry, the predictability, the quiet sense that nothing is out of line creates a kind of stillness, like standing in a room where nothing unexpected can happen. And for a moment, your mind follows that same order. It settles, it softens, because when everything around you is controlled, it begins to feel like everything inside you might be too. But slowly, almost invisibly, that comfort begins to shift. What once felt like preference starts to feel like necessity. The neatly arranged desk is no longer just satisfying, it becomes required. The routine is no longer helpful, it becomes non-negotiable. And when something moves out of place, even slightly, something inside you tightens. Why does something so small feel so big? It's not about the object. It's about what it represents. Order becomes more than organization, it becomes a language. A silent promise that things are stable, that nothing will suddenly collapse, that you won't be caught off guard. And in a world that often feels unpredictable, that promise can feel invaluable. So you begin to rely on it. You fix what's uneven. You adjust what's out of line. You repeat patterns that make the day feel safe. And each time you restore order, there's a quiet sense of control that returns. A subtle reassurance that you are still holding everything together. But beneath that reassurance, something deeper is happening. Because the more you depend on order to feel okay, the less okay you feel without it. And that's where the shift becomes important. What started as a source of calm slowly becomes something you can't step away from. Not because you want to control everything, but because not controlling it feels unbearable. Like something unseen might slip through the cracks. So the question begins to change. It's no longer, why do you like things organized? It becomes, what happens inside you when they're not? And somewhere in that answer, the real story begins. It rarely starts with perfection. It starts with unpredictability. Somewhere in the early chapters of your life, there may have been moments that felt uncertain. Not always loud, not always obvious, but enough to leave an imprint. A tone of instability, a feeling that things could shift without warning. Maybe emotions around you were inconsistent. Calm one moment, tense the next. Maybe expectations were unclear or too rigid to meet. Maybe mistakes didn't feel safe. Or maybe nothing was explained at all, just felt. And when a mind is still learning what the world is, it begins to search for patterns. Because patterns mean predictability. And predictability feels like safety. So you adapt. You start noticing what can be controlled, what can be arranged, what can be made certain, even when everything else feels unclear. You learn that if something is placed just right, done just right, repeated just right, it reduces the unknown. It gives you something to hold on to. And over time, this becomes more than a behavior. It becomes a quiet strategy. Not always conscious, not always chosen, but deeply learned. Because when the outside world feels unstable, the mind doesn't wait for stability to arrive. It creates its own version of it. Through order, through structure, through control. And it works, at least in the beginning. It brings a sense of relief, a feeling that you've found a way to stay steady in something that once felt uncertain. But what often goes unnoticed is what that strategy is built on. Fear. Not loud fear, not visible fear, but a quiet, underlying awareness that something could go wrong. So control becomes protection, not just from disorder, but from the feeling that comes with it. The discomfort, the tension, the unease that rises when things don't follow the pattern you've come to trust. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to carry that pattern forward into new environments, new relationships, new stages of life. Because once the mind learns that control creates safety, it doesn't easily forget. But here's the deeper question. What if the need for order isn't about the present at all? What if it's echoing something much older? Something that was never fully settled, only managed, feels like a choice, but often it isn't. Beneath the conscious preference for order, something deeper is quietly at work. A system designed not for perfection but for protection. The brain does not ask what is beautiful or ideal. It asks something much simpler. Is this safe? And over time, it begins to associate certain patterns with the answer. When your environment is structured, predictable, and controlled, the brain registers less uncertainty, less unpredictability. And because uncertainty is often interpreted as potential danger, reducing it creates a sense of relief. So order becomes a signal, a message that says, "You're okay." But here's where it becomes complex. The brain is not always accurate. It is efficient. It learns quickly, but it doesn't always question what it learns. If at some point order helped reduce discomfort, even temporarily, the brain remembers. It builds a connection. Disorder equals tension. Order equals calm. And once that connection is formed, it begins to repeat. Automatically. This is where cognitive rigidity begins to take shape. The mind starts favoring sameness over variation, predictability over flexibility, because variation introduces unknowns, and unknowns to a protective system feel like risk. So even small disruptions begin to feel amplified. A misplaced object, a change in routine, an unexpected interruption. Logically, they mean very little, but emotionally, they trigger something deeper. Because the brain isn't reacting to the present moment alone. It's reacting to what it has learned that moment represents. Loss of control, loss of certainty, loss of safety, and so it responds. Not with calm curiosity, but with tension, a subtle alertness, sometimes irritation, sometimes anxiety that doesn't fully make sense on the surface. And in response, you restore order. You fix what's out of place. You return things to how they should be. And when you do, the brain rewards you. It releases a sense of relief, a quiet exhale. This is how the cycle strengthens, not through logic, but through repetition. And the more it repeats, the more it feels necessary. Until one day, it no longer feels like a pattern you follow, but a pattern that follows you. From the outside, it looks like discipline, control, precision, stability. Everything appears in place. Nothing is left to chance. There is a quiet admiration that often follows. How organized, how composed, how put together. But what isn't seen is the weight it takes to maintain that image. Because order at this level is not effortless. It is maintained. And maintenance requires energy, constant awareness, a silent scanning of what feels off, a need to correct, adjust, restore. Even in stillness, there is a background tension, like a thread pulled just tight enough that it never fully relaxes. It doesn't always feel overwhelming, but it is always there. And over time, that quiet tension begins to accumulate. You might notice it in small ways. Irritation when something is moved without your control. Restlessness when plans shift unexpectedly. A subtle discomfort that lingers until things are back to normal. But what is normal? Is it the state of the environment or the state of your mind? Because when your sense of calm depends on everything around you staying consistent, your inner world becomes fragile. Not weak, but dependent. Dependent on conditions that cannot always be guaranteed. And that's where the strain begins to deepen. You start carrying an invisible responsibility to keep things from slipping, to maintain a version of stability that feels necessary, even when no one else is asking for it. And in doing so, you begin to hold more than what is yours. Control becomes a quiet burden, not because you chose it consciously, but because letting go doesn't feel safe enough. And so you keep going, adjusting, fixing, managing, holding everything together. But beneath that effort, something softer often goes unnoticed. Fatigue. Not just physical but emotional. The kind that doesn't come from doing too much, but from never fully letting go. From always needing things to be a certain way before you can feel at ease. And the question slowly rises, even if unspoken. What would happen if you stopped? Not forever, just for a moment. Would everything fall apart? Or would something inside you finally exhale? There comes a moment, quiet or sudden, when the pattern no longer holds. Something shifts. Something moves out of place. Something refuses to be controlled. And in that moment, it's not just inconvenience that rises. To something deeper, a sharp tension, a wave of discomfort that feels disproportionate to what's happening. Maybe it shows up as frustration, maybe as anxiety, maybe as a kind of internal shutdown where everything feels too much, too fast, because the structure you've relied on is no longer protecting you, and that realization can feel unsettling. Not because the situation itself is overwhelming, but because it exposes something fragile underneath. The illusion that control could prevent disruption. The belief that if everything stayed in order, nothing would go wrong. But life doesn't move that way. It interrupts. It changes. It refuses to stay within fixed lines. And when it does, the mind that has learned to depend on order feels unprepared. Not incapable, but unfamiliar with uncertainty. Like standing in a space where the rules suddenly don't apply. So the reaction intensifies. You might try to restore control immediately, fix everything, recreate the structure as quickly as possible. And if that doesn't work, the discomfort lingers. It stretches. It searches for resolution that doesn't come as easily as before. This is the moment where the pattern reveals itself most clearly. Because when control works, it feels invisible. But when it fails, it becomes undeniable. You begin to see how much of your calm was tied to conditions, how much of your stability depended on things staying predictable, and how quickly that stability can be shaken when they don't. But within that disruption, something else quietly appears. A question, not loud, not urgent, but present. If control can break this easily, was it ever true stability? Or was it something carefully held together, hoping not to be tested? This moment is uncomfortable, but it is also revealing, because for the first time, you're not just maintaining the pattern, you're seeing it. There is a subtle shift that happens when something is no longer invisible. At first, it feels unfamiliar, almost disorienting, because what once felt natural now feels observed. You begin to notice the pattern not as something you are, but as something you've been doing. The constant adjustments, the quiet urgency to restore order, the way your mind tightens around unpredictability. And slowly, a different kind of awareness emerges. Not judgment, not resistance, just recognition. You start to see that control was never really about perfection. It wasn't about things being neat or structured or aligned. It was about something much deeper, something more human. It was about safety. But now, for the first time, that idea begins to soften. Because if safety depends entirely on everything outside of you staying in place, then it is always at risk. Always one disruption away from being shaken. And something about that realization feels important. Not threatening, but clarifying. You begin to question gently, was it the order itself that made you feel calm? Or the belief that nothing would go wrong because of it? And if that belief isn't as solid as it once felt, what does that leave behind? At first, there might be discomfort in that space. A sense of looseness where there used to be structure. A quiet uncertainty that doesn't immediately resolve. But within that uncertainty, something else exists. Possibility. Because when a pattern is no longer automatic, it creates room. Room to pause. Room to notice. Room to choose even if that choice feels unfamiliar at first. And that doesn't mean letting everything fall apart. It doesn't mean abandoning structure completely. It simply means seeing it for what it is. Not a guarantee. Not a shield against life's unpredictability. But a tool. Something that can support you without defining you. And in that shift, something begins to loosen. The grip softens. The urgency quiets. not all at once, but enough to feel a difference. Enough to recognize that perhaps stability was never meant to come from controlling everything around you, but from something much quieter within. There is a quiet kind of freedom that doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't come as a sudden release, or a dramatic shift. It comes slowly, like a river loosening its grip on the edges it once carved so tightly. For so long, order may have felt like the only way to stay steady, the only way to keep things from unraveling. But now, something begins to change, not outside but within. You start to notice that not everything needs to be fixed immediately, that a misplaced detail doesn't always carry meaning, that a moment of unpredictability doesn't always lead to collapse. And at first, this feels unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, because the mind has spent so much time associating control with safety that even a small step away from it can feel like standing on uncertain ground. But the ground holds, not because everything is perfect, but because you are still there, even when it isn't. This is where something deeper begins to form, a different kind of stability, not the kind built on maintaining every detail, but the kind that exists even when details shift. It's quieter, less visible, but more real, like learning that the sky does not fall just because the clouds move, like realizing that the ocean remains, even when its surface is disturbed. And slowly you begin to trust that, not completely, not all at once, but enough to pause before reacting, enough to let something stay imperfect for a moment longer than before. And in that pause there is space. Space to feel without immediately correcting. Space to exist without constantly managing. Space to experience life as it is, not as it needs to be arranged. Because perfection was never the goal. It was protection. And now, perhaps, protection can look different. Not tighter, but softer. Not controlling every outcome, but allowing some things to unfold without interference. And in that softness, something unexpected appears. Relief. Not the kind that comes from fixing everything, but the kind that comes from not needing to. If this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you recognized itself in these patterns, then perhaps it was never just about order. Perhaps it was about the way your mind learned to stay safe, the way it adapted, the way it tried to protect you, even in ways that became heavy over time. And there is nothing wrong with that, because every pattern has a beginning, every behavior has a reason, even the ones that feel exhausting. You are not alone in this. There are many who move through the world carrying this quiet need for control, holding things together, keeping everything in place, rarely allowing themselves to fully let go. Not because they want to control everything, but because it once felt necessary. And maybe it still does in certain moments. That's okay. Awareness doesn't erase the pattern overnight. It simply changes your relationship with it. Gently, slowly, without force. And if you'd like to stay connected to reflections like this, to a space that explores the hidden corners of the human mind and the emotions we rarely speak about, you're always welcome here. And if you feel comfortable sharing, you can leave your thoughts below. Not because you have to, but because sometimes your words might help someone else feel a little less alone in their own experience. Take care of yourself. You deserve gentleness.